All right, we are logging in and setting up. All the beeps and boops are traveling across space. And with that, we are officially live for this week's very special edition of the Black Freedom Lectures. Hi and welcome. My name is Eve Ewing, and I'm the curator of the Black Freedom Lectures. I'm coming to you from the city currently known as Chicago, which is on the occupied lands of the people of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa nations, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. Part of what we like to think about at the Black Freedom Lectures is understanding how decolonization and Black liberation and abolition, all those things come together. If you're interested in learning more about that, we have a lecture with Elena E. Roberts talking about Black and Indigenous solidarities. Please check that out. Before I introduce the other wonderful people that are on this call with me, sharing this virtual space with all of us, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this series. This is a free virtual speaker series that explores dimensions of Black identity and ideas in support of Black liberation and learning. And in our normal routine that we've been doing for a few weeks now, we do two things. So first, we drop a lecture every Friday where we hear from an incredible Black scholar on some specific topic. And then a few days later, we host a live question and answer session where we dive deeper with that scholar to learn more. It's been great. All the videos are on our channel. You should watch them. But this session is going to break with that format just a little bit because Khury Petersen-Smith very graciously agreed to join us for an urgent response Q&A session to help deepen our understanding of the crisis in Palestine and the ways in which that crisis also impacts Black people around the world in the United States, and how we can just more broadly understand the project of empire, the project of settler colonialism, how it relates to white supremacy, all that stuff. We're going to get into it. So we're very grateful for Khury's time. There is no lecture this time around. It's just a Q&A. It's just us here right now doing the thing. Our next Q&A session is going to be this Thursday at 6 p.m. Central Time, featuring Barbara Ransby on the topic of Black Marxism, anti-fascism, and internationalism. So it kind of dovetails very nicely with our conversation this evening. Dr. Ransby will be expanding on her lecture on the same topic, which dropped this past Friday. If you missed it, you can watch it right here on our channel, along with other lectures and conversations, discussions about issues like colorism, Black trans identity, many more important things. If you're like, you have already talked to me too much and I can't remember any of these dates or times or any of that, don't worry, because we have a newsletter. So you can go to blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter and sign up. And every week you'll get a rundown of what we're talking about and who we're talking to. And you'll also get recommended readings. It's really terrific. You should check it out. Also, you can follow us on all the socials. We are Black Freedom Lectures on Instagram and Freedom Lectures on Twitter. I don't know how we were able to get the Twitter username Freedom Lectures in 2021. It feels like somebody should have been doing some Freedom Lectures of some type already, but we slid in through the gate. So blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter. That's all the things. Now, for this evening's conversation, I want to say thank you as always to our organizing team, Imani Legron and Sianda Mohutsiwa, as well as our fantastic ASL interpreter, Barbara Williams-Finley, and our friends and colleagues at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture and the Mellon Foundation for supporting these talks. Now, I get to introduce our featured guest. Khury Petersen-Smith is the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. He focuses on US foreign policy in the Middle East, the war on terror, and the Palestinian freedom struggle. Khury is the co-author of the 2015 Statement of Black Solidarity with Palestine. He also researches the militarization of borders and US military and political power in the Pacific. Khury has a PhD from the Clark University School of Geography, where he wrote a dissertation on US military bases in Asia. And Khury is interested in Black internationalism, interrogating US empire, building international support for the struggle to free Palestine, and solidarity with freedom struggles around the world. So Khury, thank you so much for being here with us. How are you? Are you doing okay?
It's an absolute honor to be here. I mean, to be totally honest, I'm like, my heart is pulled in so many different directions because I'm so grateful for this conversation, and have all the respect in the world for you, and just grateful to share some space and time. And also, my heart is heavy because what's happening in Palestine is absolutely, the violence is just incredibly horrific, unreal levels of colonial violence. And at the same time, amazing levels of anti-colonial resistance. Right. There is, rebellion across Palestine from Palestinians all over Palestine. And a big part of how Israeli colonization works is fragmenting the Palestinian population in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Jerusalem, in what they call Israel, in neighboring countries where folks live in refugee camps. And there is resistance across all of that right now, across all of Palestine in solidarity. So that's also amazing. So, there's a lot going on. I feel, the mix of that, but I feel a lot of gratitude to have this conversation, gratitude to the folks who organize this, gratitude for the people tuning in. And I especially want to just appreciate the Palestinian folks tuning in and like recognize like, what's on your heart, and know that, my heart is on you. And I'm grateful to get to share this space together.
Thank you so much. And I think that what you said about wherever there is pain, wherever there is harm, there's also resistance, right? And there's also struggle. And I think that's why I feel so excited to have this conversation with you and grateful, because I think that one of the things I know we're going to talk about this evening is how people on the side of oppression get to frame the terms of the conversation. And so how can we reframe the conversation around the things that we are able to do for one another, right? So this is a space where we want to honor lots of questions that we got. And we got a lot of questions through email and through social media that are at many different levels of prior knowledge and understanding. I want to say thanks to everyone who submitted a question. And thank you for being down to kind of meet us where we are. So if some people are watching this and they're like, oh, these questions are so basic, or if other people are like, oh, this is really complicated, we're going to try to meet everybody where they are. And so thank you for that. So to start, obviously, you cannot give us the entire history of the region and the time that we have. And also later in the conversation, we're going to do some shout outs of readings and resources where people can go if they want to learn more in depth. But I think one of the first things we hear from many people, especially many Black people, is I feel like I don't understand the history and the context of the situation. And so I feel like I can't intelligently speak up, especially because we're in a very combative social context, right? So people are afraid to say something and then have somebody come out at them in an argumentative way and feel like they can't stick up for their principles, right? So what would you tell those people, and where should our understanding begin? I'm not asking you to give us a crash course of 70 years of history, but help us ground us to begin where our understanding should begin in this conversation.
Yeah, I so appreciate that question. And I want to just begin my answer with another gratitude and say, well, first an acknowledgement that, I am grateful to get to speak to give my response to that question. I'm aware that I am talking about the history of Palestinian people that is not, I'm not Palestinian, you know what I mean? So I want to acknowledge that. And I want to just appreciate, honestly, everything that I know about Palestine I've learned from Palestinians. So just, express gratitude for that. And so this question of like, and I think it comes in many forms. I think this is so complicated. I heard this is too complicated. How can I take a stand? I don't know enough. And, first of all, like, I hear that, I really appreciate that, because particularly in the United States, and I think it's important to kind of locate those of us who live in this place to locate that, because this is actually a different conversation around the world. And in this place called the United States, it's particularly challenging, I think, because there's a particular effort to obscure what is happening. There's a particular effort to make you feel like you don't understand, especially for those of us who are not part of, Palestinian or Jewish or Arab, communities. We're told this has nothing to do with you. You stay out of this. And so I really hear you. Now that said, folks who feel like that are really one is we're compelled to take a stand, and that's where I want to get to in 1 second. But first is to say it's also really we're quite lucky, because I don't know if there has ever been more accessible knowledge about what is going on. Never, it is the resources available to us, primarily crafted by Palestinian folks themselves, are abundant. So that is something to be celebrated. And if you recognize that you need to learn more about this issue, you're in luck, because there's a lot of tools available to us. But so that said, we look at what's actually happening in Palestine. We look at, at the moment, the conversation, the focus is really, it's on Gaza in particular. It is, and again, the US media, US government, certainly the Israeli government media are focusing on rockets coming from Gaza. And what we hear about the other side is Israeli bombing of Gaza. We know that, those are not two equal sides. There is a military power that has an air force, an army, and a navy, and controls the land and the sea and the air. And the other does not. The other is largely defenseless, group of people confined in Gaza. So folks will know that, will see that, and recognize, even with the kind of spin, even with the framing that the media give of both sides, even with the framing that the Biden administration, US officials give of Israel has a right to defend itself. If you just look at what's happening, I mean, as of now, last I heard, 200 people have been killed in Gaza, dozens of children. So, what we're looking at is ethnic cleansing. And I think it's really important to say that it's important to talk about what's happening in Gaza, but this goes so far beyond Gaza. This round of violence and resistance didn't start in Gaza. It started in Jerusalem, okay? And where people are Palestinians are being forcibly displaced by the Israeli state and by Jewish settlers. And, the weeks leading up to this and right now, across what they call Israel, there are Israeli police and Israeli Jewish settlers attacking Palestinians in their homes, on the streets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So folks here look at that and see that, and you know enough to stand with the people who are being attacked. Do you have more to learn? Of course you do. Of course we all have more. We always have more to learn. Of course, we always have to expand and deepen our knowledge. But you really do. You know enough to recognize that this is ethnic cleansing. The last thing I'll say is I really encourage folks to go to a rally. One thing, there was an amazing round of rallies last week. Another happened over the weekend. And tomorrow actually is in Palestine. There is a general strike by Palestinians that's been called across Palestine, which is an amazing act of resistance. And there's international solidarity all around the world. So there might be a rally in your city. Go to it. I for those who say, I don't know enough, I understand, but go to it, because going to a rally, it's not only an expression of solidarity with Palestinians, it is also a context for learning. You will hear Palestinians talk about their history. You will hear them talk about what is happening to them and their families now. You might see people come out to rep Israel, and you'll hear, you'll see that exchange. That will be an education. So go, engage. You already know enough, but there's a lot of context to engage further.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much you just said that I want us to build on. But one thing I want to note for folks is, as you mentioned, there is this general strike happening tomorrow, and a lot of people here and in other parts of the world are doing actions in solidarity. And so we'll share some of those on our social media, and in a second, maybe drop some of them in the chat as well if people want to learn more. And we'll also be sharing other learning and resources. But one of the things I'm hearing you say is that this idea of you don't know enough is a strategic deployment that is intended to silence people and to move them away from what they know in their heart, what they know from, basic childhood morals and upbringing. And I was wondering if you could talk about the specific relationship between the two states currently known as the United States and Israel, and why specifically in the US context, we live in a media and political environment that reinforces that idea that we don't know enough. So can you talk about that relationship, both in terms of communications and also maybe finances?
Absolutely. This is an extremely important question, especially right now that the Biden administration is positioning itself as this kind of neutral actor, saying that we have sent this envoy to the region who is going to negotiate between Israel and the Palestinians and try to reach some kind of understanding. And the idea is that the United States can play this kind of the role of the honest broker, when in fact the United States is thoroughly on one side, thoroughly on one side, on the side of Israel. The United States gives Israel a minimum of $3 billion a year in military aid that subsidizes Israeli militarization, but really all of Israeli society and the whole project of colonizing that land, of colonizing Palestinian land.
And can I pause you on that point, Khury? Because also this happens to be something that you study globally. So how does that compare to the kinds of military aid or other types of humanitarian aid? How does that compare to where we're spending elsewhere in the world?
Again, such an important question because look, it's extremely important to engage with the particulars of the situation of Palestine, of Israel, of the U.S. relations, with the particular project of Israel, and yet, this is in a context. We should not see the U.S.-Israel relationship in isolation of a broader context of what I would argue is the U.S. empire. The U.S. is the most powerful country in the world. That's not accidental. There's this kind of idea that the U.S. kind of aw shucks its way.
We worked the hardest.
Worked really hard and just kind of emerged, as a superpower, and that's not true. There's some, the U.S. Has achieved and maintains that status through an exercise of power, of military power, of political power, of economic power. And so there's a whole lot of states in the world that the US gives military aid to. And actually the Middle East and Central Asia are, major sites of US military aid. And so in many ways, there's a number of things that are unique to the US relationship with Israel. But there's a number of ways in which Israel is actually not exceptional. I mean, if you look at the Middle East, you look at, Egypt for many years got $2 billion, $1 to $2 billion a year in military aid. Saudi Arabia gets tremendous military aid and weaponry from the United States and political support as it carries out its horrendous acts of violence in Yemen and elsewhere. The United Arab Emirates, the same thing. I could go down a line of the various states in the region that are on the U.S. payroll and that are U.S. allies. So there's a context here where the U.S. uses these relationships as part of what they say promoting its interests, but it's really about making sure that there's a certain kind of order that the United States is at the head of. It's the kind of order that the United States wants. And so, we know that the US invades places and, the US does all kinds of things directly, but no empire acts alone. And it always has allies, and Israel is a key ally. And so that, because of that relationship, which for decades has been a bipartisan support, uncontroversial among the US political class in terms of US support for Israel. That's starting to change, which is incredibly significant, but it's just starting, right? Because of that, because there's such unity in the US political class and the US elite, it means that the US media also, is largely unified in terms of a certain outlook that, whether you're whether you're watching CNN or reading New York Times or listening to NPR, you're going to hear some of the same arguments, actually. And so there's what we learn in school. What I learned in school, when I learned in elementary school, was that, Israel was a land without a people for a people without a land. That's a classic Zionist phrase that was in my social studies textbook in 6th grade. None of that is accidental. And it makes it very challenging, to live in this place and just look at it because, what you're seeing with your own eyes, and then you're hearing that it's something different, that it's two sides and it's a cycle of violence and so on. And that's not the situation.
Now, I think that for those of us, and we're going to also talk about Black people in global context in a second, but for those of us living in this country, in this nation state, I think that there's a way that some Black people are starting to be like, okay, I see things that I see are wrong happening elsewhere in the world. And I'm going to care about that and try to learn more because I'm a compassionate human being who has empathy for what's happening elsewhere. However, there are also a deep set of political, financial, corporate interests, entities that span these two nation states, so that it's not a coincidence that, for example, you see an image like we see in Ferguson or Baltimore or Chicago, where there are people, long oppressed people rising up against a state power, and what we see in Palestine, long oppressed people rising up against a state power. And those relationships are actually deeper than we think. And so could you talk a little bit about the material interests, specifically as it pertains to anti-Black violence in the United States, and the violence that we see happening in Gaza?
Right, absolutely. And I appreciate that question, and I appreciate you locating the question of Black politics and relations within this place called the United States, right? We know, and certainly folks who are part of, who've been engaging with your lecture series know that Black is an expansive category that extends all around the world. There are Black people everywhere, and there are all kinds
truly everywhere.
Truly everywhere.
Yes.
Like for real, every single where. And it means that there are innumerable relations of Black people in the global Black community to the question of the Palestinian freedom struggle and to Israeli violence. So I want to acknowledge that. I'm going to speak to what I know the most about, which is about Black America and our relationship historically to this question. And I'll say too, it's important to acknowledge that there is a relationship, because as I said earlier, one thing that we are often told in this country, again, if
it's not your business.
Right, yeah, this has nothing to do with you. And the fact is, Israel and the US have made it our business because they collaborate all the time. They recognize, the US, which is a colonial settler state and an imperial power, looks at Israel, which is a colonial settler state and was from the start, and says, okay, well, we've got something in common and we should compare notes, we should help each other out. And that relationship is extensive. It is dynamic. And so it involves not only the billions of dollars that in terms of military aid that the US gives to Israel, the US weapons that it sells to Israel. These Israeli planes are American planes. They're F-16s. They're made here. The bombs they're dropping are American bombs, right? So there's that. But then it's not a one-sided relationship. American police departments in the United States train with Israel. And this isn't like a marginal phenomenon. It's not an exaggeration to say that every major police department in this country, and a lot of police departments in small cities and all kinds of police departments, have relations with Israel. I found out I'm located here in Boston on Massachusetts and Wampanoag land. And there are a lot of college campuses here. There are campus police that train with Israel. The MBTA, which is the transit authority here, the transit police train with Israel. So this is a very extensive situation. And there are Israeli weapons that get deployed on the streets here in the city of St. Louis. Around the time of the Ferguson uprising, bought something called a skunk truck, which is an Israeli weapon. It's a truck that sprays this putrid liquid on people resisting in protest as a crowd control measure. You can't wash off this liquid; it stays on you for days. Well, this is an Israeli weapon that was developed against Palestinians, and now this American police department bought it and used it. So in so many ways, our oppressions are linked, but our resistances are also linked. And there is an incredible, rich history of Black Palestine solidarity, that goes way back. One of the more storied times is in the 1960s, the last time, 60s and 70s, the last time of great kind of anti-colonial revolt and decolonization. And organizations, Black American organizations here, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, organizations like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, organizations like the Revolutionary Union Movement in Detroit, all had relations with the Palestinians, with Palestinians in Palestine, in some cases with Palestinians here. That is a very rich history, and it's one that continues to this day. The Ferguson uprising in 2014 was this moment that kind of was its own and also called back to histories of resistance. It was a time that summer 2014, remember, it was the year that Eric Garner was murdered in New York City. Mike Brown is murdered in Ferguson. And then there's the Ferguson uprising. In that same summer, Israel launched its latest assault on Gaza. There was solidarity from Palestine with the Ferguson uprising. You mentioned in the introduction that I co-authored with my comrade, shout out to Christian Davis Bailey, an amazing militant Black, fighter for Palestine and for freedom. We co-authored this statement of Black solidarity with Palestine, but we were inspired by not one, but two statements from Palestine in solidarity with the Ferguson uprising. There were Palestinians on Twitter in Palestine who said, to our rebel comrades in Ferguson, we see you dealing with tear gas. Here's how we deal with it, right? So it was this moment, and now we're in another moment. I mean, it really breaks my heart to think like, what's happening here, what's happening there, right? We just got off the Derek Chauvin trial,
right?
A whole round of police murders of Black folks, and then once again, there is this massive assault in Palestine by Israel. It's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that we are having a white nationalist moment in this country, right, where the police are on the rampage, and that there is, a Jewish nationalist moment in Palestine where the police are on the rampage. That's not coincidental. So
no, I want to uplift two things you said there that I think are really important to just drive home.
Yeah.
One is that it is not an exaggeration to say that if you see footage of Black people getting shot by the police, getting tear gassed by the police, that they are literally using technologies, right? And by technologies, I mean both material items, right? But also ways of being that are learned and borrowed from another settler state, right? Yeah. And so I think that's really important. Like this is a material relationship. This is not just like ethical solidarity, principled solidarity. It's a material relationship. And then the other thing that I think you're saying that is so powerful is we can do that too, right? Yeah, we have the same ability to learn from each other and to learn tactically, politically, emotionally from one another. And I think that all of this, you and I, and we could have a whole different conversation about settler colonialism. And for those who aren't familiar with that term, when we say settler state or settler colonialism, what we mean is that there are people who have come to a place and displaced the original inhabitants of that place and said, we now get to build an empire here. This is our country. And we dictate the terms of what that means. And so when we say the US is a settler state, we mean that European people came here, saw indigenous people on the land, said they don't count, and this is ours now, and we get to define what a country is. The same thing happens in Australia. The same thing happens in Israel. So for those who aren't familiar with that term, that's what we mean by that. But I think both of us in the language we use are intentionally challenging the very notion of borders, and that maybe if we don't even think about these places as being different places, right, but actually as one place, then it helps us to understand the ways that these systems are learning from each other and the ways that we can also learn from each other. So I just want to uplift that as to me a very important takeaway from what you said. So we've been talking a little bit about intertwined struggles between Black people in the United States and Palestinians, both in Palestine and in diaspora across the world. And as you said, there are infinite ways to be Black, right? There are multitudinous ways to be Black. And I think that one thing that often gets sidelined in these conversations is that there are also Black Palestinians, there are Afro-Palestinians living in Gaza, living around the world, right? And so could you talk a little bit, knowing that you yourself are this is not your identity, right? But from a perspective of an accomplice, can you talk a little bit about Black Palestinians and some of the intersectional experiences that in ways that they might be uniquely vulnerable in some of these situations?
Yeah, right on. And thank you for the question, which is really important. And I acknowledge, I'm not Afro-Palestinian. I'm not Black Palestinian. And I am really in the process of learning more and engaging with these communities. So I will share what I know, but also, again, there are these really amazing resources for us to learn more. So one thing is if you look at just like Palestine's location, right? It is at a crossroads of various places and groups of people, right? And so because of histories of this place itself, there are Afro-Palestinians, like there are people of African descent who are Palestinians, who are indigenous to this place called Palestine, to Palestine. And so there's that. There are also, again, because people migrate, all around the world because Blackness is expansive. There are Black Palestinians all over the world. There are, Black Palestinians in this place called North America, and so on. So there are many different communities and different ways of being Afro-Palestinian and Black Palestinian. And I want to shout out a couple of resources. One is there's this amazing organization called Existence's Resistance. Highly recommend to engage with their work, follow them. Shout out to Nancy Mansour, who plays a key role in running that organization, and who guided me, who's a Palestinian, who guided me on when I was really privileged enough to go to Palestine, to go to Gaza. Nancy guided me in our delegation, and Nancy and Existence's Resistance have paid particular attention to building relations between the Afro-Palestinian community in Palestine and people all around the world, the solidarity struggles around the world, and in this place in particular. So that is an organization that is very deep in that work of building and maintaining those relations, and a resource in terms of learning more. And then I also, so Existence's Resistance actually have collaborated with Mark Lamont Hill, the amazing scholar who is again deeply engaged with the question of Palestine solidarity, to produce this film called Black in the Holy Land. Which speaks to.
And I think it's online. I'm going to drop the link if I have our team drop it, because I think it's online, is it not? Or he's been working on this for a long time.
Yeah. So I know where the trailer is.
Let me not put Mark on the spot if it's not done.
Yeah, I know. I don't want to,
So put you on Front Street, but we'll share the trailer.
Exactly. So check out this film as a resource. And so so there's a couple of resources I want to acknowledge too. Since we're talking about Black people in Palestine, there are Afro-Palestinians, there are Black Palestinians. It's also worth acknowledging there are Black Jewish folks, they're Black Jewish, again, in the expansive family of Blackness, we have Jewish folks, right? And that includes Black Jewish folks, who are Israeli, and they're in particular, the kind of primary Black Jewish Israeli population is folks of Ethiopian descent, who live as Israelis, who are in the Israeli military and so on, who are who as Jewish folks in a Jewish state, so-called, are enlisted in a settlement project, are part of a settlement project, and also as Black folks in that settlement project, which is racist, which is a white supremacist project. It isn't just Jewish supremacists, because it's a Jewish state, it's a white supremacist project. These European Jewish Zionists, were the founders of this project, and their kind of supremacy, the supremacy of that grouping in particular, remains central to the Israeli state. And so there are Black Jewish Israelis who experience marginalization as Black people, and serious marginalization, police harassment and violence, etc., and also participate in the colonization of Palestinian land. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, the different permutations of Blackness and of Black population. There's Black population, on different sides of this colonizing situation, an anti-colonial situation.
And it sounds like another way in which it's important for us to be in conversation across borders, because Black people in the United States, Black people in France, Black people in Brazil, right? Black people all over the world can relate to the experience of being in a place through complicated webs of colonization, chattel slavery, however it is that we got where we got in that particular situation. And what are the ways in which you are conscripted into the project of the nation state, whether or not you don't get to choose, right? We don't get to choose. Right. but what are the ways in which we choose to resist that conscription and to push against it and move through it. So I really appreciate that. And we will shout out Black in the Holy Land and a couple of other resources. And also, Mark co-authored a book that I definitely want to recommend called "Except for Palestine," which you mentioned earlier. That until very recently, this was the thing that people on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, were all on the same page, and that until very recently, like by recently I mean like this month, right? Like literally right now. If you're a quote unquote progressive, it's like except for this one matter. So. So speaking of Democrats, one of the questions we got from a couple of people was how the Obama administration specifically played a role in where we find ourselves politically today, what Barack Obama didn't do, and just talk about the Obama administration and its legacy here.
Yeah, man. Well, the Obama administration was it was an administration of it was a presidential administration of the United States, which is an imperial power.
You mean it wasn't just like a Black Boy Joy
right.
festival of happiness and good times?
Sometimes he had a kick in his step or whatever, but he. One thing just to say, I mean, Obama actually he presided over the biggest aid package to Israel in U.S. history. So, the Obama administration was not only not a neutral or progressive administration, really on. I mean, we can get a whole other conversation about evaluating the Obama years. But when it comes to U.S. empire, it was really, I mean, I'll just say, I mean, Obama escalated the war on terror. He expanded it. But when it comes to support for Israel in particular, the Obama administration was absolutely kind of enthusiastically complicit in Israeli violence, not only in terms of its horrendous abuses of the Palestinians and ongoing, dispossession and displacement and violence against Palestinian folks, but all sorts of other things that Israel does. It's wild because actually, the kind of signature foreign policy initiative of the Obama administration was what they call the Iran nuclear deal, which is this deal where, in exchange for submitting to an incredible amount of regulation of its nuclear program, the idea being that Iran could never develop a nuclear weapon, that the United States would ease the horrendous sanctions that it has carried out against Iran for decades. Now, that deal has a whole history. It was, Trump did a lot of damage to it, escalated the violence against Iran. At the moment, it's being kind of renegotiated and we'll see its outcome. But actually, when the deal was negotiated during the Obama administration, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, came to the United States and addressed a joint session of Congress to say why this deal was not okay. Because Israel did not want any kind of agreement between the U.S. and Iran. This isn't a peace agreement. To be clear, the idea is to offer some relief to Iranians, but it absolutely reiterates the kind of power relationship of domination, that the U.S. Exerts toward Iran. And yet Netanyahu said no. Even that is not okay. So anyway, whatever, that deal went forward. But my point is, the Obama administration let that happen and then gave Israel this weapons package, this aid package. So yes, the Obama administration has tremendous complicity, as whatever various U.S. presidents have in terms of Israeli violence toward Palestinians and others.
Now, one of the questions that, some people are, one answer of like, well, why did Barack Obama do these things is because he was the U.S. president. And that's the job of the presidency, right, is to oversee this empire. I think that I'm looking at the chat right now, and I think that some people are struggling with like, but why Israel? Like, why is it this one country? Like, do they have like selfies? They have incriminating photos. Like, what is it about this particular nation state that that we have what appears to be, as you pointed out, in some ways is not an exceptional relationship, but in other ways is? And to me, one potential answer of this is the similarities, right? The joint intertwined interests of these two settler states. But is it more than that, or is it really just that, like, when we look into the mirror of Israel, we see ourselves as a state? I mean, what is the real deal? Does Israel know things? Do they have embarrassing pictures of every U.S. president, when they were kids? Like, what really happened?
Right. It's such a good question, and just to parse out the answers, because there is this notion that is mobilized, particularly when we talk about the Democratic Party, because, like I said, it's a bipartisan support, right? And so particularly the Democratic Party support for Israel and the kind of liberal American support for Israel is framed in terms of well, I should say both, the right wing and liberals, embrace this notion that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. The U.S. is the world's greatest democracy. If you, by the way, that's not true. That the U.S. is not a democracy. So you also know that the other thing about Israel being a democracy is not true.
The U.S., are you telling me that a country where they're currently offering people literally a lottery in order to access life-saving vaccines,
right?
That's not the greatest democracy in the world? Wow.
I'm glad you're sitting down, Eve. Yeah. So right. So right. So that they both, Republicans and Democrats say that, but Democrats in particular frame support for Israel in terms of a response to anti-Semitism too, right? Like, Jewish folks are marginalized all around the world, and this notion, and certainly again going to my elementary school textbook, the kind of story that after the Holocaust, this unspeakably horrific crime in world history in Europe, that in recognition of the need to keep Jewish folks safe, the U.S. is committed to this state. Now, it's simply not true, and there's a number of reasons why it's not true. A key one being what the U.S. actually did during the Holocaust, which is boats of Jewish refugees fled from Europe to emigrate to the United States, and the U.S. turned them away, actually. The U.S. knew about the Holocaust before it did anything about it. So the notion that the U.S. has been, on the side of the world Jewish population, and this is in keeping with that, it's simply false. It's absolutely false. So if it isn't that, what is it? I think that what you said about this notion of a kind of identification is extremely important, but identification of what, right? It's again, one imperial power, much larger, imperial superpower, identifying with another colonial and imperial power. But they're colonial and imperial powers. And what that means is they want control and domination of the world economy to make it safe for U.S. corporations and U.S. power. And so there was a recognition on the part of the most powerful countries in the world after, in the mid-20th century, a recognition of the Middle East as this, what they came to see as a strategic place. I understand it as it's a place. It's a place where people live. You know what I mean? This place of richness and culture and all kinds of societies, right? But for the United States, for Britain, for France, for all of these imperial powers, they said, this is a strategic place because this is the location of the world's oil reserves, and therefore we will invest in our relations and our presences in this place in particular. And so the kind of Western colonization, and again, Western colonization of the Middle East predates predates the 20th century, but the question of a petroleum-based economy in particular was extremely important. And again, it not even in terms of, when we talk about the United States, not even in terms of the U.S. population's consumption of oil, but rather the world. The recognition was that much of the world is getting their oil from the Middle East, and therefore, who is in power in the Middle East has tremendous power in the world. So that's why there's all of these relationships that the U.S. maintains in that region with various states, but Israel in particular, from the start, as a settler state, as a state that, as you so beautifully and brilliantly explained, would involve people coming from elsewhere as settlers, a non-indigenous population to settle the land. That would involve and require support from imperial powers. And from the start of the Zionist movement, before Israel was even established as a state, there was a recognition of the people who envisioned the state that we're going to need the most powerful states in the world support us. And so the relationship is one of a certain convergence of interests. Israel says, we need backing to settle this place and to have this incredibly powerful military and so on. The United States says, we want an absolutely loyal state in the Middle East where we don't have to worry about things like the population. There have been times in a state like Egypt, which at the moment is a U.S. ally, but Egypt was also a center for Arab nationalism, where people rose up with a population said, we want a different future than the Western colonial future. Well, Israel, they're less concerned with that because this is a settler population that is very self-consciously involved in a colonizing project. And so this is of tremendous benefit to the United States.
What's important to me is I think you just flipped my understanding of the question, which is that we might say, what is so unique about the relationship between the United States and Israel? Or we might flip that and say, what can the relationship between the United States and Israel illustrate for us about the history of US empire and domination around the world? Because if we look in Latin America, if we look in Asia, if we look in Africa, probably somewhere on the low in Antarctica, who knows? I just don't know about it yet, right? The United States, the entire history of this country has always been interested in maintaining state power that benefits, maintaining, whether it requires assassinating people or whatever has to be done, right? Maintaining state power that benefits its own economic and political interests. And so I think it's very illuminating to recognize that is actually, a pattern. And the other thing that's so interesting is, you brought up a little bit what an issue that I know a lot of people are struggling with, which is the idea of being accused of anti-Semitism if you criticize Israel, right? Because of this horrific and genocidal, humanitarian crises that Jewish people around the world have faced, right? But what you're also pointing out is that faith and state don't have to be the same thing, right? And so being a practitioner of a faith, being a member of a culture, doesn't mean you necessarily have to be conscripted in participating in an exercise of state power that has nothing to do with that, right? That has nothing to do with your faith practices or the histories of your people. And so, I really appreciate that. And that brings us to a point of resistance that a lot of people want to know about. So many people may have heard of BDS, which stands for Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions, or Divestment and Sanctions. Could you tell us a little bit about the BDS movement? And specifically, we were asked by some people, what are some accessible ways to practice BDS, depending on, where you may be in the world or your class background. And somebody asked it as an individual question, like, how can I, as a person, stop funding Israel? So just tell us a little bit about BDS and how people can participate in it and what that means.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. And if I can say just one thing, as I get into that question, I want to say one thing about the question of anti-Semitism and the question of the solidarity that I want to argue for that we need, with our Jewish relatives who are facing, when we talk about a white nationalist moment, that historically and today means anti-Semitism in this country and around the world, but certainly to speak about this country, right? And so we saw
45 as this white supremacist president supporting Israel abroad, and then
exactly.
wildly anti-Semitic, yes. In the US. So it doesn't, absolutely. The pieces don't add up.
Right on. And there's a lot to say about that. One thing I just want to shout out, and again, going back to my earlier comment about how if you're new to Solidarity with Palestine, it's always time to be in Solidarity with Palestine, but right now we have not only all these resources that have been crafted by Palestinian folks, we also have probably the greatest, amount in history of this country, of Jewish folks who are part of the Palestine Solidarity movement, right? So shout out to Jewish Voice for Peace. Among there are several Jewish organizations in this country, including If Not Now, that organize, against Israeli colonization, and JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace in particular, really working solidarity with Palestinians. So that is important to say. And JVP is involved, along with a host of other organizations in this country and around the world, in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions kind of project. And so the idea is really that, again, Israel is carrying out this project against the Palestinian people, but it doesn't act alone. It involves not only the military and political support of countries like the United States and other powerful states in the world, but also the economic support. And Israeli companies have a certain place in the world economy. In many ways, again, thinking about the kind of privileged relationship of the US and Israel, it means that there's a privileged kind of access that Israeli corporations have to the US economy. Again, a lot of that, is about the control of the kind of colonial control of people. There's this Israeli company called Elbit Systems, which is, they work in military technologies, and the U.S. has employed Elbit Systems in its militarization of the southern border with Mexico, right? So this is what that collaboration looks like, and it means that there are all sorts of sectors of U.S. society that are invested in the Israeli economy and in Israeli society. And so that means, I live here in Massachusetts. It means that there are like delegations of elected officials in Massachusetts to Israel to talk about how can we strengthen ties with the Israeli economy. It means that universities across this country are invested in Israel and so on. So BDS, first of all, they take inspiration from other boycott movements throughout history, including the movement to boycott South African apartheid, including the boycott movements as part of the civil rights movement here in the Black freedom struggle in this place called the United States. And it is this accessible, nonviolent thing that anybody can access because, unfortunately, the relations with the Israeli economy and society are so ubiquitous. So if you're on a college campus in particular, if you don't know already, it's worth researching in what ways is my campus invested in Israeli apartheid. And many, I want to shout out another organization, Students for Justice in Palestine, which has chapters across the country, have done that kind of research and have found out that kind of investment. And then the campaign to say we need to divest actually from Israel. There's all kinds of companies, in Boston at the moment, there's a campaign against the company Puma, which has some relations with Israel.
First New Balance and now Puma. Boston is having a hard time with
gym shoes. Okay, we got work to do. Right. But they support like Israeli sports teams and therefore are part of normalizing Israeli apartheid, right? And so there's a campaign against that. So honestly, you can really kind of like just run a web search for BDS in your location. If you have a retirement fund, a lot of retirement funds are invested in Israel. Like one way or another, Israeli apartheid finds us, so we can find our entry point into resisting it and joining the BDS movement.
And I think that there's a couple things about that again I want to uplift and co-sign. One is the book we mentioned earlier, Except for Palestine, which is co-authored by Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick. One of the points they made in that book that I thought was important for me to understand as a learner is that for years there's been this painting of Palestinian people as violent, right? Which is also Islamophobic, which is also Orientalist, right? Which is also racist, all those things. Yes. And so when BDS arises as a nonviolent protest movement, right? suddenly that is, well, that's anti-Semitic or that's offensive. And I think that that's an example. We began our conversation by talking about the importance of pushing against frames that are handed to us.
Mm-hmm.
And, what a boycott says is exactly what you said. I'm choosing not to act as though this is fine. I'm
Right.
choosing to refrain from my participating in something that is not okay, that is not normal. And I think that one of the biggest questions, I refer to myself as like an Amazon abstainer. And one of the biggest pushbacks I get is, I can't really abstain from Amazon, right? Because websites that I don't even know, right? They host their servers on Amazon, and they own all types of things that I don't even know they own. But part of it is, what is the statement that we make when we choose to
Yes.
stand up with other people and say, I want to try to act like this is not fine, right? And so for people that are thinking, oh, I want to participate in BDS, but what if I accidentally buy something, or what if toilet paper becomes scarce again, and then I have to buy this toilet paper, and then I find out later it's owned by a company that's owned by a company that's owned by, like, that is not the point. How do we make a principled, because at the end of the day, right, these are multi-bazillion gajillion dollar contracts that are little pennies, can make a difference, but it's not the Montgomery bus boycott. It's not a micro economy. But how do we say, this is not fine? I don't want to participate. I'm going to take opportunities to educate other people about my choice not to participate, and think about what that means. And so I think that's really important. And I'm also hearing just the levels of connections when we take time to learn, because we are already talking about violence against Black people in Ferguson, and now we're talking about violence against Central American and Mexican people from along the border also
That's right.
being related. So we are close to the hour, and I want to respect your time as I continue to rant enthusiastically. I'm going to ask you two more questions, Khury, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Is that cool with
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, absolutely.
And as you're talking, before you answer those questions, one thing I want to do is I'm going to share my screen, because you were kind enough to share with us some Palestinian organizations and people to follow, to learn, and stay plugged in. So I'm gonna share my screen and put those up as I ask you a question about what can we do to unlearn what we have learned, right? And so by that, I don't just mean like, we didn't learn any of this history and let's go listen to podcasts and, figure out what year, what happened and when, but psychologically, right? The normalization of a settler state, how can we start to unlearn that? And what are some of the mental or psychological or spiritual practices that you would recommend for just shifting our worldview on this issue?
Man, that is such an important question. And, the answer, it's challenging, because the truth is, colonization, is not just this kind of event that happened once in history. Colonization happens literally every day. It's reiterated every day. And essential for it to work is a certain level of consent and buy-in and ideological acceptance of its values and its understandings. And so that means that we are colonized every single day. And so it's an ongoing practice, I think, to decolonize. And I want to lift up one amazing resource, is the book "Freedom is a Constant Struggle" by Angela Davis, which she writes about a lot of things, or speaks. It's mostly transcriptions of conversations. She speaks about a lot of things, but speaks extensively about the Palestinian freedom struggle and intersections of the Black freedom struggle. And this notion that it's an ongoing process, I think, is extremely important. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like this goes to the question too of like that you asked first, do I know enough to stand in solidarity? And like, there's no moment where I think we will like graduate, you know what I mean, with our like degree in like, and be like free of colonization. I mean, until the world is free of colonization, which I believe will happen. I believe will happen in our lifetimes. And I believe that we should understand that it will happen and fight like it's going to happen. But part of that process of fighting is a constant struggle, in the world and in our minds, for real. So I just want to, I'll say though, in response to the question, I think a lot about the amazing freedom fighter Assata Shakur, who her autobiography, highly recommend reading and rereading. And she talks so beautifully about solidarity and internationalism and how she came into solidarity with Puerto Rican folks and with folks indigenous to this place called North America, and how when she found herself at first in conversation with those folks, she realized, she felt embarrassed because she realized all of the kind of anti-Puerto Rican racism, the anti-indigenous racism that she had accepted as somebody who grew up in this place, right? And she talks about how she wants to be in solidarity, but to do that, like she's thought, I need to know these people's stories from their perspective. I need to know who their heroes are. I need to know their histories. And so it's a commitment, you know what I mean, to learning those things. It's an ongoing commitment to ever deepening our knowledge in our solidarity. And I think that's part of the process. But again, it's a constant process until we are free.
The writer Kathy Park Hong was talking in an interview recently about solidarity between Black and Asian communities and recognizing anti-Blackness in Asian communities, while also thinking about ways that Black people can step up or understand anti-Asian violence. And she said this thing that I can't stop thinking about, which is we only know what white people have told us about each other, right? And so if we were to expand that, if you're white or whatever your background is, in this case, we only know what these states that none of us really believe in or are really benefiting from or that invested in, we only know what they've told us about each other, right? And so if we know that they lie on us, why would we believe the things they say about somebody else, right?
That's so important. Yes. Just real quick, because and again, it's important to engage with Palestine on its terms, learn its history, etc. And also we have to make the connection. So when you that they say that our protests are violent because we're disrupting traffic or whatever,
right? You're like,
we're being killed, right? So we've heard that about us. So when they say, "Oh, Palestinians are violent," the violence, make the connection. Make the connection.
Right.
Because they make the connection.
Right. They make the connection to the tune of many, many dollars. Right. I'm going to close with one final question with deep gratitude. Actually, I'm going to say my advertisements first so that I can keep people sucked in and they have to hear my various advertisements before they get to hear your answer to the final question. So speaking of internationalism, our next Black Freedom Lecture is going to be the incredible Barbara Ransby. It's truly a brilliant scholar on the topic of Black Marxism, internationalism, and anti-fascism. If you thought anti-fascism was only for white people, you were wrong. There are Black anti-fascists. We've been out here in these streets. And so Barbara is going to be talking about that. Dr. Ransby will be talking about that. And that conversation will be this Thursday at 6 p.m. Central. And once again, if you don't want to remember that, you can follow us on all the socials or sign up for our newsletter at blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter. And you can watch Barbara's lecture on this very YouTube channel. It's already up. You can watch it right now when you're done listening to us. All right, final question.
Yes.
People really want to know specific things to do, Khury. And so they want to know, what does solidarity look like right now? Our very first Black Freedom Lecture was C. Riley Snorton. And Professor Snorton said, we need to think about entanglement, not just solidarity, entanglement. And it is clear from this conversation that there is a lot of entanglement happening, right? And so what does solidarity look like right now? What can people do today, tomorrow, this week, next week, for the rest of their lives, knowing that, as you said, this is a constant struggle?
Right. Thank you for the question. And I'll just, I want to acknowledge, like, Palestinians are telling us what we can do to be in solidarity with them. And so I know that the different orgs and people who I mentioned, will be sent out through Eve's various channels in this amazing lecture series. So stay tuned to that, the newsletter, the social, etc. I just want to shout out real quick the Institute for Middle East Understanding, IMEU, at the IMEU on Twitter and Instagram. A couple other people, Nora Erekat, who's an amazing Palestinian scholar. Omar Badar, another Palestinian scholar, Mohammed El Kurd. You can find all these people, and again, we'll find ways to communicate to you all where to find them on social media. But these folks, I think, I mean, of course, there's like literally millions of Palestinians, to engage with and have conversation with, and who are on social media and so on. These folks, I want to shout out in particular, who I think who are familiar with the kind of colonial arguments and really help with the reframe. And again, there's so many more. So yeah, get plugged in. You'll see more. But what folks are saying is, I mean, again, there's a Palestinian general strike tomorrow, right? And they're asking for solidarity protests all around the world. So folks, go to a protest for real is one way. BDS was developed by Palestinians, a Palestinian call from Palestine saying, find out the ways, I mean, you named it, entanglement. Find out the ways that you and your community are entangled in Israeli apartheid, and disrupt it by boycotting and divesting and calling on the governments against the US government, for those of us here who give privileged status to the administrators of Israeli apartheid. So there are so many ways that we are connected with this, and that we can be invested in Palestinian freedom. So that's it. I think taking a lead from Palestinian folks, and yeah, committing to that learning too. That's part of the process, and it helps us disrupt. And to be honest, I mean, look, it's all about a free Palestine, because this kind of violence has to end. Palestinians who are displaced, I mean, largely a refugee population displaced all around the world, even within Palestine, are displaced from their homes in a way that continues to happen. That needs to end. Palestinians need to be able to return home and thrive beyond the ways that they're already thriving and have already produced such richness and so on. And also, I promise you that, for what it's worth, if you engage with the Palestinian freedom struggle, I guarantee you will learn about your own freedom struggle. You'll learn about yourself, your own conditions. It will enhance any other freedom struggle that you are also invested in. And again, that's not accidental. It is because we really are bound together. You know what I mean? That isn't rhetorical. And there's so many ways that our freedom is bound up with that of Palestinians. But there's also so many ways in which the Palestinian freedom struggle is so heroic. It is such an education. Learning about it certainly changed my life. I have tremendous gratitude to the Palestinian freedom struggle. So I encourage you to engage, again, for Palestinian freedom, and also, truthfully, for a liberated world, the freedom of us all.
Well, what's so powerful about that, Khury, is that the technologies, the strategies, the organizing that we see people use to fight for freedom around the world, that we invent new things with every generation, but we learn from previous generations, right? And so the BDS movement, as you said, going back to the global boycott to end apartheid in South Africa, going back to the civil rights movement boycotts, right? And going this like Cesar Chavez, like people all over the world have used these things. And so when we take the time to learn about them, we are learning about each other's histories. And we are also resisting being conscripted into something that we didn't choose, and that most of us, it's not working out that great for a lot of people. And so I really want to say thank you so very much for your time. Specifically, this is, I'll just say publicly, this is something I asked you to do very last minute. We have never met before. And so I was in the streets like, who has Khury's email? Who could, so I really appreciate you and am really grateful for your time. And for everybody who's watching, thank you so much for taking this step to come and be in community together, to say, I actually don't know everything about this, and that's okay. And I recognize the process of my learning as a necessary step to step up and do what needs to be done for myself and for the people around me as a member of a global community. So I'm really grateful to all of you tuning in with us this evening. Please join us again, and follow us specifically right after we get off. I'll make sure everybody on Black Freedom Lectures on our Instagram that we reshare all the things that you shared with us tonight. Thank you so much, Khury. And last thing, where can people find you if they want to learn more about what you do?
You can find me on Twitter. If you search for you know my name. If you are watching this, you can search me on Twitter. You can find me there. And please stay in touch. And what an absolute honor to have this conversation and to be in solidarity with the Palestinian freedom struggle. What an absolute honor and a pleasure to talk to you. Serious gratitude for doing this. Serious gratitude to our interpreter, Barb. I know I was talking fast.
The GOAT, the legend.
Thank you. But serious gratitude to making the space for this urgent conversation.
Well, thank you so much. We want to say thanks one more time to the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, the Mellon Foundation. Thank you, Khury. Thank you, Imani and Sianda, our incredible team. Thank you, Barb, the greatest ASL interpreter in the known multiverse. And if you liked this video, it's still going to be up after we're done conversating. And so you can share it with somebody. That's it. I'm Eve Ewing. Thanks for joining us. And